The massive winter storm currently sweeping the United States continues to have an impact on travel in Jamaica. The storm has resulted in thousands of flight cancellations globally.
Is the United States quietly slowing down Jamaicans from leaving? Why were nearly 30 flights to Jamaica suddenly canceled while other international routes continued operating? And is this really just about weather, or is something bigger unfolding behind the scenes? Before jumping to conclusions, it is important to separate speculation from what we can actually verify, because what is happening right now reaches far beyond airport departure boards. It touches travel, emergency response, healthcare, governance, and the fragile economic recovery Jamaica is still struggling to protect. This is not just a local update. It is a global disruption with local consequences, and Jamaica is once again caught in the middle. We begin with the event that triggered widespread anxiety across the island. A powerful winter storm sweeping across large sections of the United States has caused one of the most severe aviation disruptions seen since the height of the pandemic. And Jamaica has felt the impact immediately. According to the Airports Authority of Jamaica, 30 inbound flights from the United States were canceled in a single wave. 16 of those cancellations affected Norman Manley International Airport in Kingston, while 14 impacted Sangster International Airport in Montego Bay. These were not minor delays or short reroutes. Entire flights were removed from schedules, leaving hundreds of passengers stranded, plans disrupted, and airport terminals filled with uncertainty. The storm itself is no exaggeration. Meteorological data from the United States shows snowfall totals ranging from 10 to 20 inches across multiple regions, including parts of the Northeast and the South. Temperatures dropped to dangerously low levels, triggering emergency alerts, power outages, and statewide warnings affecting millions of residents. Airports in major hubs were forced to ground operations as runways iced over. Aircraft required extensive de-icing, and crew availability collapsed under unsafe conditions. Airlines, already operating on tight margins and limited staffing, made the decision to cancel routes en masse rather than risk mid-air diversions or ground emergencies. From a technical standpoint, Jamaica was not singled out. The cancellations were part of a much larger shutdown of U.S. air travel. But from a Jamaican perspective, the consequences feel very personal. The United States remains Jamaica's largest source of visitors, family travel, medical transit, and business movement. When flights from the U.S. stop, the effects ripple outward almost immediately. Families miss long-planned reunions. Medical appointments are postponed. Tourism revenue takes a hit that cannot be recovered once the window passes. Small operators, from taxi drivers to ghost houses, feel the loss within days. And perhaps most damaging of all is the uncertainty. When flights stop without a clear restart date, people are left waiting, checking updates, and wondering whether the disruption is temporary or a sign of something deeper. That uncertainty feeds anxiety, and anxiety often fuels speculation. But while the skies were grounding planes, pressure was building elsewhere on the island. On the ground, Jamaica's emergency response system is dealing with a crisis of its own, one that has nothing to do with weather and everything to do with behavior. The Jamaica Fire Brigade has raised a serious alarm over a sharp increase in prank calls to emergency lines, a trend that officials say is now putting lives at risk. Between 2021 and the end of 2025, firefighters received more than 8,200 false emergency calls. That represents a staggering 131% increase over a 5-year period. The trajectory is worrying. In 2021, prank calls stood at just over 1,100. By 2025, that number had surged past 2,700 calls in a single year. These are not harmless jokes or minor disruptions. Each false call triggers a full emergency response. Fire trucks are dispatched, crews mobilize, equipment is deployed, and while resources are tied up responding to fake emergencies, real ones may go unanswered. Fire Brigade Commissioner Stuart Beckford has been blunt about the danger. He explains that every false alarm drains a system that is already stretched thin. Fire stations do not have unlimited trucks or personnel. When one unit is diverted unnecessarily, coverage elsewhere is reduced. He shared a sobering example. A fire unit responding to a false report in Clarendon was later involved in a serious collision with a delivery truck. The impact was severe enough to take that entire unit out of service for an extended period while repairs were carried out. That single prank call did not just waste time. It physically removed emergency capacity from the system, leaving other communities more vulnerable in the meantime. Commissioner Beckford points to increased access to mobile phones among children as a major factor behind the surge. While acknowledging that phones are essential tools for education and communication, he stresses that they also require guidance and responsibility. Emergency lines are not toys. They are lifelines. Parents and guardians, he says, must actively teach children when and how these services should be used. Because misuse does not just inconvenience responders. It can cost lives. From emergency services, the focus shifts to Jamaica's roads, where the data tells a more mixed story. There is cautious optimism, but officials are warning strongly against complacency. So far in 2026, 19 road deaths have been recorded. This marks a notable decrease compared to the same period in 2025, when 28 fatalities were reported. On the surface, this appears to be progress. Fewer lives lost, fewer families grieving, fewer headlines filled with tragedy. But road safety experts say the improvement is fragile. Dr. Lucian Jones, Vice Chair of the National Road Safety Council, argues that road safety must be treated with the same urgency and seriousness as violent crime. In his view, too many Jamaicans still see traffic deaths as unfortunate accidents rather than preventable outcomes. One of his strongest warnings focuses on seatbelt use. There remains a widespread belief that rear seat passengers do not need to buckle up. Dr. Jones describes this thinking as outdated and dangerous. Crash physics do not change based on where someone is sitting. In a collision, unrestrained passengers become projectiles, putting themselves and others at risk. Data from the Ministry of Health supports his concern. In 2024, a significant proportion of injured men and women involved in crashes were not wearing seatbelts, regardless of seating position. Dr. Jones also raises serious alarm over impaired driving. Alcohol and marijuana use behind the wheel, he says, remain widespread and socially tolerated in ways that would be unthinkable in many other countries. He points to reports of taxi drivers openly drinking or using marijuana while operating vehicles, a practice that puts passengers and pedestrians in immediate danger. Many of the fatalities recorded on Jamaica's roads involve young people, often in their most productive years. His message is direct. Stronger enforcement is needed. Better roadside testing is required. And perhaps most importantly, there must be a shift in public attitude toward personal responsibility. From roads, the pressure moves into Jamaica's hospitals. Inside the health system, nurses are bearing the brunt of rising frustration and systemic strain. The Nurses Association of Jamaica reports an increase in verbal abuse directed at nurses by patients and their relatives, driven largely by overcrowding, long wait times, and shortages of resources. Association President Dawn Marie Richards says nurses have become the visible face of a system under stress, absorbing anger for problems they did not create and cannot fix. Nurses do not control bed availability. They do not decide how many doctors are on shift. They do not determine how quickly equipment is repaired or replaced. Yet they're often the first point of contact, standing between desperate patients and an overwhelmed system. Richards appeals to the public for patience and empathy. She reminds Jamaicans that nurses are advocates for patients, not obstacles. Their goal is care, not delay, and verbal abuse only worsens an already difficult working environment. She acknowledges that nurse migration continues to affect staffing levels as trained professionals seek better pay and conditions overseas. However, she notes that the outflow is not as severe as in previous years. Still, she warns that without meaningful improvements to working conditions, the pressures pushing nurses to leave will remain. Amid the strain, there is some encouraging movement. The Health Ministry has announced changes aimed at making pediatric care more humane and emotionally supportive. At Bustamante Hospital for Children, A new pilot initiative now allows parents or guardians, under specific conditions, to remain with hospitalized children until late evening hours. The policy shift recognizes what research has long shown. Emotional stability plays a major role in recovery, especially for children facing the fear and confusion of hospitalization. Parents are permitted to assist with basic care under medical supervision. This includes feeding, reading, and comforting children during treatment. The presence of a familiar face can reduce anxiety, improve cooperation, and support healing. In addition, a 15-bed overnight facility for parents and children traveling from outside the area is nearing completion. This is expected to ease the burden on families who previously had to choose between staying nearby at personal expense or leaving children alone overnight. The initiative represents a small but meaningful step toward family-centered healthcare. From health, attention turns to governance and transparency. Advocacy group Jamaicans for Justice is renewing its call for reform of the Access to Information Act, arguing that the law is failing to deliver on its promise. Their review of recent data shows that only about 30% of information requests were completed within the legally required 30-day period. More than a third of requests were not fulfilled at all. The group argues that broad exemptions, weak enforcement mechanisms, and a lack of penalties allow public bodies to delay or deny access without consequence. They warn that transparency is not optional in a democracy. It is essential to public trust and accountability. Without timely access to information, citizens are left in the dark, speculation fills the gaps, and confidence in institutions erodes. We close where we began, with the storm. The winter system continues to paralyze large sections of the United States. Millions remain without power. Emergency declarations are active across multiple states, and flight cancellations have reached levels not seen since the COVID era. For Jamaica, this storm is more than weather abroad. It is a reminder of how tightly the island is bound to global systems and how quickly disruptions elsewhere can reshape daily life at home. When the world stumbles, Jamaica feels it fast. While the winter storm dominates headlines, it is not the only force shaping Jamaica's present moment. Beneath the surface of weather alerts and flight cancellations, other pressures are building quietly but steadily, influencing how the country functions and how resilient it can remain when global systems falter. This is where the story widens. Because disruptions rarely arrive one at a time, they stack. And when they do, they expose weaknesses that often go unnoticed during calmer periods. In the business sector, that reality is already evident. Small and medium-sized enterprises remain among the most vulnerable parts of Jamaica's economy. Many are still recovering from recent natural disasters, supply chain disruptions, and rising operating costs. Hurricanes, flooding, and inflation have combined to create an uneven recovery, where survival depends less on innovation and more on access to capital. It is within this context that the Small Business Association of Jamaica is preparing to sign an agreement with Alaska Financial Services. The partnership is intended to provide more accessible financing to small businesses still reeling from the impact of Hurricane Melissa. The focus is not luxury expansion or speculative growth. It is stabilization, affordable loans, flexible repayment terms, and faster access to working capital can mean the difference between reopening and permanent closure for many operators. For small retailers, farmers, transport providers, and service businesses, cash flow remains the single greatest challenge. When storms disrupt tourism, reduce foot traffic, or damage infrastructure, small businesses feel it first and recover last. Larger corporations can absorb shocks. Small enterprises often cannot. This makes economic resilience inseparable from financial inclusion. But the pressure is not confined to Jamaica's borders. Globally, economic uncertainty is intensifying, and its effects are rippling into Caribbean markets. Gold prices have surged past $5,000 an ounce for the first time in history. This milestone reflects more than simple market enthusiasm. It signals deep unease about global stability. Investors traditionally turn to gold when confidence in currencies, governments, or geopolitical stability weakens. Rising gold prices suggest that many see turbulence ahead. Geopolitical tensions involving the United States, ongoing conflicts in multiple regions, and concerns over debt sustainability have all contributed to this surge. For Jamaica, higher gold prices have mixed implications. They can boost export earnings in the short term, but they also reflect conditions that tend to slow global growth. Slower growth abroad often translates into reduced tourism, tighter credit, and cautious investment at home. At the regional level, public health concerns are also resurfacing. Barbados has reported a rise in syphilis cases, prompting renewed warnings from health officials and calls for increased testing and public awareness. While the issue is not isolated to Barbados, the development underscores how interconnected Caribbean health outcomes are. Migration, travel, and tourism mean that public health challenges rarely stay contained within national borders. Early detection, education, and coordinated regional responses become critical, especially as healthcare systems remain under strain. All of this unfolds against the backdrop of Jamaica's ongoing effort to maintain stability while navigating global uncertainty. And that brings us back to the question that opened this story. Is Jamaica simply experiencing the downstream effects of a powerful U.S. winter storm? Or is the discomfort many feel rooted in something deeper, something structural? To answer that, it helps to look beyond the immediate disruption and examine patterns. Jamaica's reliance on external systems is not new. For decades, the island's economy has been closely tied to the United States through tourism, remittances, trade, education, and migration pathways. This relationship has brought undeniable benefits, but has also created dependencies. When flights are canceled, the impact is immediate. When visa policies shift, families wait in limbo. When economic conditions tighten in the U.S., Jamaican households feel it through reduced remittances and fewer opportunities. What feels new is not the dependence itself, but how visible its consequences have become. The pandemic exposed how quickly global systems can shut down. Supply chains froze, borders closed, entire industries paused. What was once considered unthinkable became routine. The current storm, while far less severe than a global pandemic, reactivates that collective memory. It reminds people how little control small nations often have over events unfolding elsewhere. This sense of vulnerability fuels speculation. When disruptions happen repeatedly, people begin to question motives, patterns, and intentions. That is where conspiracy-style narratives often take hold. Not because they are accurate, but because they offer a sense of explanation in moments of uncertainty. But separating emotion from evidence remains essential. There is no verified indication that the recent flight cancellations were targeted at Jamaica or designed to restrict Jamaican movement. Aviation data shows widespread cancellations across numerous routes, affecting domestic and international travel alike. Weather systems do not discriminate by destination. However, it would also be naive to ignore the broader context in which these disruptions occur. Global mobility is changing. Governments are reassessing migration policies. Border controls are tightening in many regions. Security concerns, labor market pressures, and political shifts are reshaping how movement is managed. In that environment, disruptions feel heavier because they land on top of existing anxieties. For Jamaicans with family abroad, delayed flights are not just inconveniences. They disrupt care arrangements, employment schedules, and emotional bonds. For businesses dependent on steady travel flows, uncertainty undermines planning and investment. For healthcare systems already stretched thin, even small increases in demand or delays in supply deliveries can have outsized effects. This is why the storm matters, even after the snow melts. It is not the weather alone. It is what the weather reveals. It reveals how quickly systems can buckle under stress. It reveals where redundancies are lacking. It reveals how interconnected Jamaica's fortunes are with decisions and conditions beyond its control. At the same time, the story is not one of helplessness. Jamaica has navigated global shocks before. The island has endured economic crises, natural disasters, and political transitions that reshaped entire generations. Resilience is not an abstract concept here. It is lived experience. The challenge lies in translating that resilience into long-term structural strength. Diversifying tourism markets, strengthening regional trade, investing in healthcare capacity, modernizing emergency services, and enforcing transparency are not isolated goals. They are interconnected strategies. When emergency lines are misused, response times suffer. When roads are unsafe, hospitals fill faster. When nurses are overworked and abused, migration accelerates. When transparency weakens, trust erodes. Each issue compounds the others. The winter storm did not create these challenges. It simply illuminated them. As flights gradually resume and weather warnings are lifted, attention will shift elsewhere. Headlines will move on, but the underlying questions remain. How prepared is Jamaica for a world where disruptions are becoming more frequent, not less? How dependent should the island remain on a single dominant partner? And how can systems be strengthened so that when the next shock arrives, the impact is absorbed rather than amplified? These are not questions with quick answers. They require policy consistency, public cooperation, and long-term investment. They also require honest conversations about responsibility, both at the individual level and within institutions. Parents teaching children how to use emergency services responsibly. Drivers choosing sobriety and seatbelts. Patients treating healthcare workers with respect. Public bodies honoring transparency laws. Resilience is built through everyday choices as much as through grand strategies. As this story closes, the image of grounded planes lingers, not because of what they represent physically, but because of what they symbolize. Motion interrupted, systems paused, certainty shaken, but grounded planes also eventually take off again. The storm will pass, flights will resume, schedules will normalize. What matters is what lessons remain once normalcy returns. Because in an increasingly unpredictable world, the ability to adapt quickly, communicate clearly, and act responsibly may prove more valuable than any single economic indicator. And for Jamaica, those qualities may determine not just how it survives disruptions, but how it emerges stronger on the other side.